Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here yet again with another episode of my series where we explore the most interesting and disturbing solved true crime cases. As usual, before we continue, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and to ding that notification bell and turn on all notifications. On August 13th, 2020, 28-year-old Cody DeLisa was shot twice in the head inside his own home in Adams County, Colorado. His body wasn't discovered until the following day, when his employer and landlord, concerned that he hadn't answered his phone, requested a welfare check. Deputies from the Adams County Sheriff's Office found Cody unresponsive, lying in a pool of blood. What investigators would eventually uncover was a plot that hadn't been brewing for months, or even weeks. It had materialized apparently spontaneously in the span of a single fateful bus ride. Cody's girlfriend, Ashley White, would ultimately be convicted for her role in orchestrating his death, alongside a man she'd met just hours before the killing. The case is remarkable not only for the senselessness of the crime itself, but for the bizarre chain of events that led to it and the troubling questions it leaves about the trigger man. In the months leading up to the killing, White and Cody's relationship had become deeply strained. The couple lived together in a residence located in Commerce City, Colorado, and the central source of friction between them was employment. Cody frequently criticized White for her inability to secure a full-time job, and this constant pressure created a toxic atmosphere within the home. White, for her part, grew increasingly resentful, and she wrote in her personal diary that she regretted ever meeting Cody. This is a detail that prosecutors would later use to establish her state of mind in the period before the slaying. Despite this, by all indications, neither party was willing to walk away from the relationship, and the resentment continued to build with no healthy outlet. Also, this is one of the parts I find so baffling about this story, since these two had no kids and were renting a home. They had nothing concrete binding them together, aside from a relationship both of them apparently hated. The tension didn't stay confined to verbal arguments. Prosecutors described an alarming incident in which White attempted to drown and then burn Cody's cat. And no, you don't have to rewind here. He stayed together with her after she attempted to end the life of a theoretically beloved pet, a fact that strikes me as particularly disturbing. I don't want to engage in serious victim blaming here, but I absolutely have to question why this wasn't the final straw for Cody. I suppose he may have been looking for a way out, and he may have been concerned that a breakup could push her over the edge to even more serious violence. Naturally, this behavior raised serious concerns about White's mental well-being and signaled a dangerous escalation in her frustration. While the cat apparently survived the ordeal, the episode painted a deeply disturbing picture of a person whose emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. It also showed that her capacity for violence was growing, since sick puppies like this often vent their anger on helpless animals first. The relationship, by all accounts, had become a pressure cooker, and what it needed was a spark, which came on August 13th, 2020. On that day, White attended a job interview in Denver. A neighbor had reportedly driven her to the interview, and she was returning home via public transit. During the ride, she texted Cody about how the interview had gone, and his response was dismissive. DeLisa expressed skepticism about her chances of landing the job, and this upset White considerably. It was during this exchange of messages, while sitting on a public bus, surrounded by ordinary commuters going about their daily lives, that the seeds of the crime were planted. White began talking to a stranger on the bus, who introduced himself as Scott. The conversation quickly took a dark and unusual turn when Scott asked White whether she was in a relationship, which isn't all that unusual. But then the man started asking a series of bizarre questions about whether she was being indecently assaulted by Cody. For whatever reason, White told him that he had been doing these sick acts to her, and Scott's response, according to prosecutors, was immediate and extreme. He told White that they needed to kill Cody and that he had the perfect gun they could use for just such an instance. The two of them got off the bus together some distance from White's home but close to Scott's residence. They spent time together and even fired Scott's weapon before making their way to White's residence. The speed with which this plan came together is staggering. In a matter of perhaps an hour or two, a complete stranger had proposed a killing, and White had agreed to it. When White and Scott arrived at the residence, Scott introduced himself to Delisa as White's brother visiting from Texas. Cody apparently accepted this explanation at face value and welcomed the man into their home without suspicion. And I say apparently here because this is her story of what happened, but I do find it hard to believe a mystery brother was accepted so readily. A short time later, Cody was shot twice in the head, allegedly by Scott, and he died inside the home he shared with White. Before leaving, White and Scott stole Delisa's wallet, and the two then spent the next few days together in the area before Scott departed. White later told investigators that she never saw him again after that, and she wasn't even sure if Scott was his real name. Cody's body wasn't found until August 14th, when deputies conducted a welfare check prompted by his employer and landlord. He hadn't answered his phone all day, which was unusual enough to raise immediate concern. When deputies arrived at the residence, they found him lying in a pool of his own blood, quite obviously already deceased, and his girlfriend was nowhere to be found. White was identified as a person of interest relatively quickly, and she spoke with investigators where she gave the account we now have. Ultimately, she was arrested on August 16th, 2020, and she was charged with the premeditated slaying of her boyfriend. One of the most unusual aspects of this case was the identity of White's accomplice. She'd told investigators about a man named Scott, but she claimed she didn't know his real name or where he'd gone after they parted ways. For 3 years, the identity of this man remained a mystery. But then, in 2023, a woman contacted the district attorney's office with a startling claim. She said she was the girlfriend of a man named Michael Stratton, and she believed Stratton was the shooter. She laid out details of a confession Stratton had allegedly made to her, and those details matched White's account of the crime with disturbing precision. Stratton, it turned out, was already in custody, and he'd been arrested for the killing of a 39-year-old man named Michael Hunt in Pueblo, Colorado. Hunt had been homeless in Pueblo for some time, and his body had been found in an alley on South Union Street on August 30th, 2020, just weeks after Cody's was found. If Stratton was indeed the man who shot Cody, then he committed a second killing less than 3 weeks later in a different Colorado city. However, Stratton was eventually deemed incompetent to stand trial in the Pueblo case, and he has never been charged in connection with this case. White's case took nearly 5 years to reach trial, partly due to the court delays stemming from the events of 2020. The proceedings began on January 6, 2025, and the trial would be unexpectedly contentious. Over the course of nearly 3 weeks, the jury heard extensive testimony about the volatile relationship, the chance encounter on the bus, and the events of the night of August 13th. The prosecution presented evidence including White's diary entries and her own detailed statements to investigators. Prosecutors argued that White bore significant responsibility for Delisa's death, having conspired with a stranger to carry out the attack and then participated in robbing the victim afterward. The jury ultimately convicted White, not in the first degree, which had been the original charge, but of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. She was also found guilty of conspiracy to commit the crime, as well as the subsequent looting of his body. The distinction between a first and second-degree charge is significant under Colorado law. First degree requires proof of deliberation and premeditation, while second degree involves knowingly causing the death of another person. Now, personally looking at the facts here, I don't see how this wasn't a virtual slam dunk on the greater charge, but I've never practiced criminal law. The jury's decision suggests they believed White acted knowingly, but perhaps didn't find the level of premeditation required for a first-degree conviction. They may have also had reservations about the precise nature of her involvement in the actual shooting itself, but I find this less likely given her own statements to detectives. White's defense attorney pushed back forcefully against the conviction. In a statement to the Denver Post, she maintained that her client was innocent and declared that the case was far from over, indicating plans to appeal. She argued that the district attorney's office should be prosecuting Cody's actual killer instead of focusing on White, noting that authorities knew who Scott was. This was an apparent reference to Michael Stratton, who had been identified as the likely shooter. And I do have to specify that he was only identified as the likely shooter and was never conclusively identified, even by White. She claimed he remained uncharged in connection with Cody's death, due to being found incompetent to stand trial in his other case. For that last point, I agree that the defense's position raises uncomfortable questions about the case. If Stratton was indeed the person who pulled the trigger, and if he can't be tried due to mental incompetency, then the legal system's ability to deliver justice for Cody is inherently limited. White was convicted for her role in conspiring to bring about the crime, but the actual shooter may never face a jury for this particular crime, and wasn't even part of the proceedings. Whether one views this as a reasonable outcome or a miscarriage of justice likely depends on how one weighs White's culpability against Stratton's apparent mental state. Now, here's one thing I find very unusual and interesting about the investigation, and I bet a bunch of you watching may have thought the same thing. White attended at Scott's home to see the weapon and fire off some shots, at least according to her own statement, if that's to be believed. We also know that she was texting Cody while she was on the bus, since she was expressing dissatisfaction with her job interview. I have to question whether detectives attempted to obtain any sort of tracking information from her phone, which may have indicated exactly where Scott's house was. At any rate, I suspect that the appeals process in this case will be incredibly lengthy, and I hope to have further updates on this case in the coming years. There's also another possibility that I considered while researching this case, and another one I'm sure many of you are thinking as well. It's also theoretically possible that Scott wasn't even a real person, and that the story was just invented to attempt to shift blame. That said, all evidence does seem to indicate that there was a very real and very deranged person on that bus, and that it was likely Stratton, especially given his subsequent acts. The killing of Cody DeLisa is a case that resists easy categorization. It wasn't a carefully plotted assassination or a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was something stranger and more unsettling, an attack that was conceived and executed within the span of a few hours, born from a chance meeting with a violent stranger on a public bus. Having covered hundreds of these cases on this channel, this may be the most bizarre and unsettling fact pattern I've seen outside of serial predator cases. Hey everyone, thanks for making it this far. Just jumping back in quickly to give a gentle reminder to hit subscribe if you haven't already. But hey, you do you. When I'm watching YouTube on my TV, I personally never hit the subscribe button. On the evening of December 28, 2017, a 28-year-old father of two named Andrew Finch stepped onto the front porch of his mother's home in Wichita, Kansas. He'd seen police lights flashing outside and wanted to know what was going on. Within 10 seconds of opening that door, he was dead, struck by a single rifle round, fired by an officer positioned across the street. Finch hadn't committed any crime. He wasn't armed, and there were no weapons in the house. He had absolutely no idea why armed officers had surrounded his home, because the entire situation had been manufactured by strangers he'd never met. These individuals were playing a video game he'd never played, fighting over a wager worth literally $1.50. The killing of Andrew Finch became the most high-profile case of swatting in American history. It forced the country to reckon with a dangerous intersection of online culture and gaming toxicity, as well as police training issues. It's a case where every single person involved made choices that compounded into catastrophe. That is, except for the one man who paid the ultimate price. Before getting into the specifics, it's worth understanding what swatting actually is, especially for those who aren't familiar with the darker side of gaming and online culture. The term refers to making a fraudulent emergency call, typically reporting a violent crime in progress, to trigger a massive armed police response at a specific address. The name comes from SWAT teams, the tactical units that respond to hostage situations and active shooters. By the mid-2000s, swatting had become an increasingly common form of harassment and retaliation within certain online communities. It was particularly popular among gamers and internet trolls who generally viewed it as a way to bring real-life consequences to their perceived online enemies. Perpetrators generally used caller ID spoofing and voice-over IP technology to disguise their location while placing these calls. For many, the thrill was watching chaos unfold, sometimes through the victim's own live stream. It was generally treated as a quote-unquote prank, a flex of digital power. But what happened in Wichita proved just how deadly that so-called joke could become. The chain of events began with a highly contentious match of Call of Duty World War II that was played with real money on the line. Casey Viner, an 18-year-old from North College Hill in Ohio, was playing online with Shane Gaskell, a 19-year-old from Wichita. The two got into a heated argument after Gaskell allegedly caused them to lose a match through friendly fire. Viner, furious over the loss and a wager reportedly worth just $1.50, threatened to have Gaskell swatted. It wasn't an idle threat, since Viner knew someone who could make it happen and had a long history of the practice. That someone was Tyler Barris, a 25-year-old from Los Angeles, who'd built a reputation in certain corners of the internet as a prolific swatter. Operating under the online alias Swatastic, Tyler had claimed responsibility for dozens of fake bomb threats and swatting incidents across the United States and Canada. He'd already served time for calling in a bomb threat to a Los Angeles television station in 2016 and had been released months before the Wichita incident. Swatting wasn't something Barris did reluctantly, and he'd told a journalist that he found bomb threats fun and exciting, and that he got a rush from evading law enforcement. His lifestyle appeared to bear this out, and he clearly wasn't doing it for profit, as he was homeless, allowing him to essentially be a ghost to law enforcement. When Gaskell realized Tyler had started following him on Twitter and suspected what was coming, he didn't back down, but instead chose to directly challenge this swatter. He gave Tyler a former address in Wichita, a house on West McCormick Street, where Gaskell's family had previously lived before being evicted in 2016. He taunted Tyler to go ahead and try something, and even invited him to show up at his house directly. It was a reckless dare, and it put someone else's life directly in the crosshairs. Using the free Wi-Fi at a public library in South Los Angeles, Tyler placed a call to the Wichita City Hall, which was then transferred to the 911 dispatch center. Okay, so quick intermission. I had to make some changes to my script here since I originally described why this process works so well. For safety reasons, and to not get this video demonetized, I'm not going to explain the exact method of why this worked. Just to be absolutely clear, committing these sorts of acts of swatting is a serious crime, and shouldn't ever be done under any circumstances whatsoever. Tyler, identifying himself as Brian, told the operator that he was at the McCormick Street address and that he'd shot his father in the head. He said that he was holding his mother and brother as hostages and that he was going to do the same thing to them. But if that wasn't enough, he went a step further to push an even more overwhelming emergency response from the cops. He said he'd poured gasoline around the house and was thinking about setting it on fire, potentially starting a blaze that could engulf neighboring houses as well. It was a harrowing scenario, the kind of call that demands an immediate and overwhelming police response. However, Tyler didn't realize he'd been bamboozled, and the address Tyler gave didn't belong to Shane Gaskell anymore. It belonged to Andrew Finch, who lived there with his mother Lisa and other family members. Finch wasn't a gamer, and he had no connection whatsoever to any of the three men involved in this event. He was a young father who loved his two children, was passionate about art, and had been studying to become a tattoo artist. He was, in the most complete and terrible sense, an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. Wichita police officers arrived at the McCormick Street address at approximately 6:24 in the evening. Importantly, the officers who responded weren't members of a SWAT team and hadn't received specialized training for tactical situations or hostage rescues. They surrounded the house based entirely on the information from Tyler's fabricated call, believing they were confronting an armed killer holding hostages. Andrew Finch's mother, Lisa, noticed the police lights outside and opened the front door to see what was happening. Unfortunately, it was her son that then came to the porch to investigate what exactly was going on. What happened next took only seconds after officers ordered Finch to put his hands up. According to testimony, he began to raise them but then lowered them again, perhaps being unsure what was actually happening. Officer Justin Rapp, who was positioned approximately 40 yards away across the street armed with a rifle, fired a single shot, which struck Finch square in the chest. He was rushed to a nearby hospital but was pronounced dead just 17 minutes after being shot. Tyler was arrested the very next day in Los Angeles on a fugitive warrant connected to a prior bomb threat charge. He was extradited to Kansas in January 2018 and charged with involuntary manslaughter. As the investigation expanded, authorities uncovered the full scope of his activities. In November 2018, he pleaded guilty to 51 federal charges, including making a false report resulting in death, cyberstalking, conspiracy, and dozens of other crimes. In March 2019, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, believed at the time to be the longest sentence ever imposed for swatting. He was also ordered to formally apologize to the Finch family and pay restitution, though I suspect any apology was meaningless and that he had no means to pay anything regardless. Casey Viner, the Ohio teenager who'd initiated the swatting request, eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Text messages revealed his panic after learning someone had died. He'd texted an associate that he was going to prison because he'd literally told someone they were going to be swatted. In the end, he received a sentence of 15 months in federal prison for his actions, a very questionable deal considering that without him, none of this would have happened. Shane Gaskell, who'd provided the old address and taunted Tyler into carrying out the attack, was sentenced to 18 months in prison. The officer who pulled the trigger, Justin Rapp, faced a different kind of reckoning. In April 2018, Sedgwick County District Attorney Mark Bennett announced that Rapp wouldn't face criminal charges. Bennett explained that the officer's decision had been made in the context of the false information provided by Barris's call. He said that charging him would require evidence rather than the benefit of hindsight. Rapp had initially told investigators he thought Finch may have had a gun, but later testified that he never actually saw a weapon and instead fired based on Finch's hand motions. These two stories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and it likely speaks to the fact that these officers weren't on a SWAT team and had no specialized training for this situation. The decision not to charge Rapp was met with outrage from the Finch family and the broader Wichita community. Making matters worse, the Wichita Police Department subsequently promoted Rapp to the rank of detective, a decision criticized by Wichita's mayor and city council members. The Finch family refused to let Andrew's death become just another statistic. They filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Rapp, the city of Wichita, and other responding officers, initially seeking $25 million in damages. The family's attorney, Andrew Stroth, described the case as one of the most egregious police shootings in the country. After a significant 5-year legal battle with a number of preliminary hearings, in March 2023, the Wichita City Council ended up approving a $5 million settlement to the family. The family's spokesperson said the money would go into a trust for Finch's 2 children, though she emphasized that no amount could replace their father. Andrew Finch's death prompted legislative action at both the state and federal level. In March 2018, just months after the shooting, the Kansas state legislature approved a bill making it a Class 1 felony to create a false alarm resulting in injury or death. A mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years was brought in for such cases, with a maximum of 40 years. Anyway, this story has really gotten to me on a personal level, probably because I'm something of a gamer myself, and I've seen a bunch of stupid petty disputes over games in my time. At the end of the day, Andrew Finch's life was taken, and his family was torn apart, all because 2 idiots couldn't move on over $1.50. Then when Gaskell knew he was being targeted by a known serial swatter, he decided it was appropriate to put complete strangers in the crosshairs. As for the officer himself, he has to live the rest of his life knowing that a split-second decision ended the life of a completely innocent man.